When Franklin Roosevelt designated Fort Jefferson a national monument in 1935, the fort had long since been abandoned and left to ruin. Started nearly 100 years earlier as a guard into the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico, the fort was never entirely completed. One of the most ambitious and extensive brick masonry structures in the Americas, the fort first outgrew and then outlived its original purpose. The harsh, isolated environment was expensive to work in and maintain, while quickly advancing technologies made the fort's defensive purpose obsolete. When Franklin Roosevelt walked through Fort Jefferson in 1934 while touring the Dry Tortugas, the once thriving surroundings that had hosted thousands of soldiers, sailors, enslaved workers, and prisoners had now been reduced to a single groundskeeper and a cook from Cuba. With the designation of Fort Jefferson as a national monument, Franklin Roosevelt handed responsibility for the preservation and protection of Fort Jefferson to the National Park Service. Located in a remote, desolate, and harsh environment, the fort itself sits on a group of islands known today as the Dry Tortugas. Dry because there was no reliable source for fresh water. From the start of its recorded history, the Tortugas were known for the difficulties they presented. The waters surrounding the islands are home to hundreds of shipwrecks, leading to the first structure to be built on the site, a lighthouse to help guide ships around the shallows. When the Army first surveyed the islands as a possible site for a fort, they were immediately dismissed as too impossible an environment from which to work. And now the National Park Service needed to come up with a plan to care for the fort with far fewer resources, but in this same environment already deemed too difficult a location to maintain. But the challenges of the location are an important part of the history of Fort Jefferson and the story of the rapidly growing United States of the early 19th century. At that time, several nations were expanding through the Caribbean, and the United States was competing with them for territory and resources. When the British Army invaded and burned Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812, the United States learned how important permanent coastal defenses would be in the defense of the country. While the British were able to easily invade and destroy the capital, they were stopped from doing the same to Baltimore just a few miles north. A small fort on the harbor was able to hold off the invading force. Army strategists took notice, and at the war's end, Congress pushed for a series of permanent coastal fortifications along the entire coast of the United States. Far south from Baltimore, the Tortugas Islands would be acquired by the United States when Florida became a territory in 1821. The islands were located on the edge of the Floridian Plateau, in a corridor that acted as the entrance to the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, thereby encouraging a fort that could guard almost the entire southwestern coastline. There were symbolic appearances to be guarded as well. The Caribbean hosted critical and lucrative trade routes, and as a border defense against other expanding empires, the fort needed to make clear all of the military strength of the United States to any passing ships. When Congress approved the funds for construction, they intentionally set out to create the largest and most technologically advanced fort the world had ever seen. Construction began in 1846 and would continue on for the next 30 years. But before the fort could ever be completed, its purpose would become obsolete. With just a few sudden changes in cannon technology, the coastal fortifications once considered impervious to attack were suddenly antiquated and vulnerable. It was the start of the Civil War that quickly showed how outdated brick forts were to modern weaponry. Rifled pointed shells were used to pummel Fort Pulaski into a quick surrender, and with that surrender, the age of large, unreinforced masonry fortresses armed with smoothbore artillery came to a close. With Florida seceding from the Union, Fort Jefferson, controlled by the Union Army and built for deterrence, was strongly armed in order to enforce the Navy's southern blockade against the Confederate States. It was during the Civil War that the fort adapted the most, as hundreds of Union deserters and civilians were held there and forced to help with the continuation of building its walls. Before the Civil War, this work was carried out mostly by contracted slave labor under the direction of a few highly skilled masons. But by the war's end, The fort had outlived its usefulness to the Army. In 1888, the Army turned the location over to the Treasury Department as a quarantine stop, later becoming a Navy coaling station at the turn of the century, and ultimately being abandoned militarily to become a natural refuge for the birds. The mission of the National Park Service states that they must maintain and preserve its resources into perpetuity. With Fort Jefferson, the park inherited a maintenance and preservation responsibility that even the United States Army, with its thousands of workers, was unable to complete. How does the National Park Service maintain in perpetuity this massive brick structure on a remote island with limited facilities, staff, and resources? The problems are unique and complicated. The island has no reliable source for fresh water. All food and supplies must be brought to the island. Currently, there are facilities for only a small staff to live on the island at any one time. Preservation and maintenance workers must be ferried in with all of the supplies and construction materials they need to maintain the fort and its facilities. And in the greatest of ironies, one of the innovations that made Fort Jefferson so advanced and indestructible in its time has been slowly destroying the fort's walls. Totten shutters, genius defensive ornaments in their time that allowed for the cannon crews of the fort to fire and then be instantaneously protected from return fire through advanced design and locking mechanisms, are now compromising the structural integrity of the fort. After decades of exposure of the iron components to the marine environment, corrosion and expansion of the Totten shutter systems bends and breaks apart the surrounding brick walls, creating further loss of historic fabric. In the late 1980s, the National Park Service developed a plan to remove the rusting Totten shutter components and to replace them with in-kind replicas. This work was coupled with additional masonry efforts to stabilize the surrounding exterior fort walls from the parapet to the waterline. It's a necessary step in the plan to stabilize Fort Jefferson, and also for the park to continue to follow its mission to preserve Fort Jefferson for the education and enjoyment of future generations.